We provide the analytics for over 2,000 different video services. And so we have a really good perspective of kind of what's going on in the marketplace today.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the video analytics category. I'm super excited to be here with Marty, who's the CEO of Wicket Labs. Marty, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. Why we're having this interview? We've actually looked at well over 50 companies within the video analytics category. One of the companies that really stood out to us was Wicket Labs. The process of aggregating a lot of data and really building audience insights is quite unique, and how they've built out benchmarks and indexes that we'll get into a little bit later is also quite unique, I think, for the industry. So really excited to have this conversation. Again, thanks, Marty, for doing this. Maybe to start off, we will cut to the video that you provided with us. Gives the audience a good baseline as who is Wicket Labs, what you guys are doing, and we'll jump into questions. Sounds good?
Sounds great.
The continued fragmentation of the traditional pay television audience has created new challenges and new opportunities. Media companies, searching for new ways to reach their target audience, have created silos of data business leaders need to see, compare, and synthesize to make informed decisions and track results. The effective use of this data will be a decisive factor in determining the winners in the future of TV. And to compete effectively in this evolving marketplace, companies need a new level of sophistication in their business intelligence tools. The Wicket Scorecard is the leading audience insights platform that delivers unique, data-driven insights for video businesses to excel in this new arena. Integrated data provides a unified view across a breadth of metrics, opening up access for teams and improving visibility into customers, subscribers, and members. Gain deep insight into what drives new customer acquisition and why customers churn. Track gains and losses by marketing sources, membership plans, acquisition channels, and more with persistent milestones to correlate changes. Easily view key metrics that matter to your service's heartbeat, and view your business through an external lens with our industry benchmarks. Effectively identify how your subscribers and trialists are engaging your video service. Your content's effectiveness can be viewed with Content Explorer or the Attention Index, allowing you to quickly evaluate connections between titles, which may require further scrutiny, as well as surfacing hidden gems. The Customer Happiness Index, or CHI, incorporated throughout Wicket Scorecard, uses data from your service to identify at-risk subscribers and your happiest customers. All of these insights are made actionable across the full customer lifecycle through subscriber export. Acquire more of your best customers, convert stalled trialists, drive engagement, save at-risk customers, and reconnect lost subs. To wrap it all up in a tidy package, the executive summary presents a curated view of the business and puts the right information in front of the right audience. Finally, to save you time logging into multiple systems, cobbling together financial reports, the distribution page clearly outlines the effectiveness of third-party app stores and distribution partners, providing you with historical and future payment information. We also believe this is a team sport. Our customer success team makes onboarding easy, injecting ideas and industry best practices based on what your data tells them. And with dozens of pre-built integrations, getting your data into the Wicket Scorecard is simple. Guide your decisions with industry benchmarks across a variety of key metrics. Drive results with your data by improving audience acquisition, service engagement, and reducing churn. And remember, our customer success team does the heavy lifting for you, so you're set up for success. The Wicket Scorecard. Increase your audience lifetime value through data-driven insights.
Thank you so much for the video. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add on the background of what might be in some of the things that you guys are doing at Wicket Labs, but I'm also curious about if there's a backstory.
The backstory for the company, we've been in the digital video space almost from the beginning, actually. Dating myself, I was actually a product manager on a product called Real Video in 1997 from a company called Real Networks. So trying to get these streams over a 56K modem was a challenge. And so we've been, as part of that, my co-founder, Ian, actually started a company called The Platform, which is one of the original online video platforms. I built that up and I ended up selling that to Comcast. And then we ended up working and operating that as a company under Comcast for another, I was there for 10 years actually. And when I left, which was over 5 years ago, about 65% of all the broadcasting cable networks were using us here in the US to get their videos online and set up for all the different devices that they wanted to reach. So we had a pretty good understanding about what was going on in the streaming space. The backstory for Wicket Labs comes from that time. Our customers would come to us and say, well, you guys aggregate all of our metadata for content discovery and all of our entitlement data about who can watch what video, when, and where. Could you also aggregate our analytics data? So about 4 years ago, Ian and I got back together looking at that particular problem set. We thought it was pretty interesting because it was not part of our roadmap or core competency at our last company, but we thought that was a really interesting problem to solve. And what we saw was two things. When we went back out and talked to our friends in the industry, people were really struggling that the marketing system didn't use the same ID as the subscriber system, that the video and site analytics would tell you what video they watched, but not whether that was a movie or an episode. If it was an episode, what series and what season, and all the other things that we really need to understand about that content. And so we thought there was a really interesting problem to solve there. The second thing that we really liked about it, and the fundamental thesis of the company, is that every media company needed to establish a much better relationship with their audience than they historically had. We think about the traditional media model. That was, you were selling to a pay TV operator or you were selling to advertisers. That was your two customer bases. And the audience was just whatever Nielsen told you was on at Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. And so now we needed to really establish a way to, when do we talk to our audience members? How do we talk to them? What's the right message? Who's at risk? Who's engaged? All those types of things. It really relies on data. And so we thought there was a really interesting problem to be solved there, an urgent problem and an increasingly important problem for both traditional media companies as well as these new media companies that are jumping into the space and growing up to be the next big media company in the market today. So that's how we thought about the company. And so since then, now we provide the analytics for over 2,000 different video services. And so we have a really good perspective of kind of what's going on in the marketplace today. And it's been a pretty fun ride, yeah, so far.
It's interesting to see how you've seen the video ecosystem evolve over time. And I have more questions about that later. But I want to go back on the product and kind of zero in on, you mentioned that your customers had initially that interest of aggregating a lot of the video analytics and data that they had. Can you share with us the different types of data streams or how different types of data that you are collecting and what you're trying to find from that data, or at least what your customers are trying to accomplish with that data?
Yeah. So a couple things that we look at. So for all video services, there's really two fundamental questions that we have out there. And it really doesn't matter what the business model is, whether it's subscription or advertising or communications or education. Those two fundamental questions are, how are our customers engaging with our video service today? Where are they spending time? How frequently are they using the service? Things like that. The second question that everyone has is, how is my content performing? Is it working with my audience? Or are they bailing out of that particular program or that particular video or that particular class? And so those are really fundamental questions for every video service. And to your point then, once we understand that those are the questions we want to answer, we can work back. And the two primary data sets that we're looking for there would be our video view data, but also pulling in all the video metadata that we have around that content. So it's not just good enough to say, hey, we watched this video title. We actually need to understand that if it's a sporting event, what team is it associated with? What league is it associated with? What season are we playing in? Because we need to be able to compare how that's performing against last season, things like that. For fitness, it's, what instructor is actually teaching that class, and are we growing audience or shrinking audience from one class to the next class, things like that. These are all things that we want to understand about that content. The second big focus that we have at Wicket Labs is around these subscription video services that are in the marketplace today. We felt like that was a kind of a greenfield opportunity. And so we really focused on that as a company. And in that particular case, what we found was now we need to understand how to acquire users efficiently, because customer acquisition is really competitive, how to engage those users. And when they're at risk, how do we then save those users from leaving the service overall? And so to really understand that kind of data, what we also need to flesh out then is all the revenue and subscriber events. So when they subscribe or when they're in a trial, things like that, but really some nuances that really come into that. So if you have a trial period and the consumer gets to the end of the trial period, but their credit card doesn't work or their billing mechanism doesn't work. Well, it turns out you don't really cancel the trial. So they're not lost, but they're not a customer. What you really do is you go through this process where you retry the credit card every couple of days. It's called the Dunning process. So being able to track those events at a very micro level really gives us a better understanding about how our trials are working or how our customers are engaging, things like that. The other thing we really look at there is marketing data to come in. Where are people coming in from? Social working very effectively for us. What about our email campaigns that we might be engaging new users with? Lookalike campaigns on a Facebook or a Google are really effective these days for acquiring new audience members. Once they come in, it's not just good enough to track them through and say, well, they signed up for a trial, so our trial acquisition cost was X. You actually have to track that all the way through all the revenue events as well to see how many of those converted, became good customers. What was the lifetime value of that cohort that came in under our social programs and things like that? And so that's the kind of analysis that we start to bring in. I'd say the last piece of data that we bring in that's really important is distribution data from the different app stores that everybody sells through. You get a lot of data and individualized viewing data from an Apple or a Google when you have your own apps, whenever you have your own apps. But there's plenty of places like Amazon channels where you just hand them over your content and they send you a spreadsheet at the end of the week or the end of the month. And that data is pretty sparse, but we still need to be able to pull that in and understand it, because for a lot of the video subscription services that are out there, it can be 50% of their audience is actually in those channels like Amazon channels or Apple TV Plus or Roku channels, things like that. And so we really also want to understand them. You don't get enough data to really drive the business, but you can use the data you have from your own apps and your own sites as a proxy to really understand what's working well in those particular distribution channels that are out there today.
Impressive. No, it was one of the things when looking at the breadth of types of data sources that you collect and how you combine all of it together is impressive. You have what you talked about before. It's not just the basic level of the engagement from the site to the app itself. You're collecting context of the actual content. You even mentioned the distribution, payment tools, and how that I like how you said that you're really trying to understand the relationship that your customers are, helping them understand the relationship that they have with their own customers or viewers. So it's really interesting. I'm curious what metrics or maybe what modules or what tools of your platform that really resonate with your customers the most.
I think there's kind of three phases, and there's different teams inside of our organization, inside of our customers, engage with the data differently. Under the hood, behind the scenes, for every data project, they say that data harmonization work is 70% of the effort that goes into any data project. Just being able to harmonize all those different data sources, create that Rosetta Stone for that audience member so we can identify the different IDs that they have, all that kind of stuff, put that together. And it turns out that is really appreciated by the technical teams that we work with, the data teams that we work with, in terms of our ability to harmonize that data from all those different data sources and set it up in a really clean way. And a lot of people really underestimate. They think that, hey, we can just throw some SQL queries at this stuff and it'll all work out and things like that. And that is no longer the case. The data engineering discipline is its own practice in and of itself. You really have to understand how fragile data can be, because there's always nulls that are coming through or missing data. You have to test for that stuff. You have to be able to deploy updates to that code without breaking the whole data pipeline and things like that. And so that in and of itself is a big effort. Unfortunately, it's just foundational. It doesn't provide any value back to the business. It just sets the data up to be used. The second thing we would say is for the dashboard, there are a million bad dashboards that are out there. And everybody talks about the liberation of all this data and how you can throw a chart and graph or BI or Tableau or Looker and all this other stuff. And that's fine. And I actually talked to a friend and I took over our data team and we have 218 different dashboards that nobody looks at any of them, right? Because every time there was a question that came up, they created a new chart and graph and it spiders out from there. So what we find around the scorecard for us is, and the bar is, does it tell a story that leads to a decision or an action? You really have to cull down. And sometimes our customers will come to us and say, hey, can you really explain that to us? And can you add that into the scorecard? And our bar has to be really high. It has to be, if that's just a curiosity, we can go solve that with some other query and just a one-off. If it's something I'm really looking into just for right now, again, probably doesn't make the threshold to make it into a product-based approach to it. But if we see a repeatable pattern where every week or every month we're making a decision on that, or we're taking an action on that data, that rises to the level of folding that in. And then it's really incumbent on us to make sure that, again, the way that data is visualized tells a natural story. We always joke because like pie charts are useless because they're just this static thing. It's interesting, but what do I do with that? What I need to understand is some context about the trend line that might be happening against it, or a benchmark about where I stack up against something else. Or there's just all these other things to look at that, which doesn't really lead you to it needs to lead to a good decision. And the last thing I would say is where our customers really get involved with the scorecard, and probably the most important part of the overall product is taking that data and plugging it right back into their marketing system or their in-app notification system, or helping with the content licensing decision to really understand, is this content valuable to my particular audience? And so feeding that right back into marketing. So a great example of that, everybody who has trials, and I've been keying on trials today, they have stalled trialists. They've come in, that user's watched one video, they signed up, but have only watched one video. You've only got 7 days to identify those users and get after them in some way. So you might get a little more aggressive with your outreach to that cohort of users to say, hey guys, we've got all this other great content, or check us out on all these other devices that we actually have this content available on. These are the types of things that identifying those particular users, you really have to make it a really efficient pipeline that actually comes in from all these sources, gets processed, and then pipes right back into their marketing system like a HubSpot or a MailChimp or Salesforce or whatever that is, so that they can then go take action on it really efficiently.
Interesting. No, I like you talk about how the end goal is to increase the audience lifetime value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's impressive is the couple components that you mentioned, which is there's the number one, aggregating and building up the most important data, at least, is one technological feat in itself. And then the second component of that is being able to filter out what's actually can be a decision that's going to impact the business, the content, whatever. Those are putting those two things together and then making that process seamless is a challenge, which you guys have done, and it's fantastic. You talked a little bit about it earlier, and I just wanted to highlight it again, just so that the audience has a good understanding. Why has this been a challenge? Why has this been a really big issue for a lot of your customers?
I think that, backing up a second, I think that you talk to a lot of these organizations and they say, we really need to own our data. But again, I think that they underestimate the effort that's ahead of them in this particular case. So one challenge is being able to, again, just harmonize all that data, get it all in, get it all cleaned up, get it transformed in all the right ways. That is a heavy engineering lift. There's a ton of complexity behind the scenes. So as we bring in data from now 48 different systems that we have integrations with, we're validating that data showed up, that it's in the right format, that even the data itself for every video view or every revenue event is correctly being represented. And you have to test for that in an automated way, such that in your processing, I think last month we processed about 15 terabytes of data every day, of data that we can roll through across our customer base. And so that has to be you have to have a very disciplined approach that happens to that. And the second thing I'd say is that what we find for the challenges that people really look at around visualizing that data is, again, they often end up answering specific questions that the business might have, but those may not reach that bar of, every single week we're looking at that data. Every single week we're looking at that kind of engagement model. So that's one of the challenges. The third one we find often is there's often a friction between the data teams internally and the marketing teams. So marketing teams need to pull data every single day to run their next campaign, to target the next right cohort of users. And the data teams are rightly so protective of their data warehouse or their data lake. Just somebody running random queries into it can spool up all kinds of resources. And so you also have to create a really safe space there where marketing can get the data they need to run the campaigns that they want to do that kind of outreach to acquire new users, engage their current users. At the same time, you have to create a space where the data engineering team doesn't have to be, they're not on call to constantly answer those one-off queries every single day. And we see some of that friction that we're able to come in and help alleviate a lot. So there's all kinds of challenges that are in the tactics of the day-to-day, but those are some of the macro things that we see around or the institutional problems that kind of exist today in the market.
One of the things that I wanted to backtrack on a little bit earlier was one of the things that you mentioned, which is your objective is to really help your customers make decisions about how to move forward. You highlighted it a little bit, but I really wanted to highlight it again because I think it really sets apart a lot of companies in the space that are just, there's the BI tools, and then there's the companies that are really helping you make a decision and making impactful decisions in an important way. You talked about how your goal is to help them get more customers, to convert stalled trials, to reconnect lost subs. I don't know if you have other examples of what you could share, some of the ways in which you supported your customers, but a lot of it is you talked about, it's that feedback loop, giving it back to those marketing teams, being able to reconnect with the right audience, or even what's the right decision for content sales.
A couple really good examples popped to mind. Last year, we introduced a kind of a new engagement model. So traditionally, when you looked at video analytics, you'd say, well, what's my total audience size this week versus last week, things like that. What about my total video views? Are they going up or going down? Things like that. But again, we didn't find that data was actionable enough. It was interesting, but I couldn't really do anything around that. And so what we came up with was this idea of our own engagement model that's based on frequency. So we start to look at the number, how people are engaging with your video service as an example. So new users are fresh to the service, engaged users are watching videos, but then they start to drift away. Our recent users haven't watched anything in the last week, but they were active in the prior 3 weeks. Our idle users haven't watched anything in the last month, but they were really active 2 months ago. So they were watching video in the prior 2 months. It turns out some really interesting things come out of that. So idle users tend to have a lifetime value that is 30 to 50% lower than our engaged users. Seems intuitive, but it really highlights the risk that is in those idle users that are drifting away from a video service. And so we have to get after them, where we might do maybe an email or a newsletter letting people know about the new content coming out, letting them know what's on the site or in the apps every 3 weeks. For those idle users, we want to get more aggressive. We want to hit those guys at least once a week to try and pull them back into the service. The other fascinating thing is we have our inactive users haven't watched anything in 3 months. They might still be paying for a subscription service, or we still have them, but they haven't really engaged at all in 3 months. It turns out that inactive users actually have a higher lifetime value than idle users because they're used to paying. It turns out that inactive users, all of our customers tell these stories. They're like, yeah, we rolled out a new Roku app and it was really exciting. And we told everybody about it. And then churn spiked the next day because we just reminded a bunch of people they have a gym membership they're not using, basically. And so ended users, actually, when we want to carve them off from our outreach on a regular basis and start to treat them like a win back, we want to look a little bit deeper to say, what kind of shows were you a fan of? Maybe we have a new season that's coming out. Or what kind of genres were you really into? We've got another great program that works in that. Or, hey, you tuned in for a particular tennis match last year. It's coming up again. Come on back. And so these are the types of things where going a little bit deeper into that data and really understanding how our audience is engaging with each one of these video services allows us to break them off into cohorts and then target them more appropriately to keep them engaged and keep them as part of our overall audience, our overall customer base over time. So those are just some examples of how the tactics that we have found to be really useful in terms of engaging audience, not just at a hey, we're growing our overall audience size, that's great, but actually understanding the nuances behind that, where we might be growing our audience, but we've got a whole cohort that's just falling off or falling away from our service. We have to get after them before we lose them completely.
Really interesting to see the different types of the difference between the active and the idle and inactive users. I'm curious because of just since you're in the position that you're in, and I'm not sure how you've seen customers manage their own content, but is there I suppose it's also a combination of things, but is there typically a trend when content isn't performing? Tends to be the content itself? Is it the distribution? It's just you're not reaching out as much as you should, depending on the cohort?
Content performance is the number one driver, right? It is for people staying with the service, whether it's a subscription service or not, it's all content, right? Everybody talks about, hey, I optimize my click-through, my click stream analysis, all that other stuff. 80% of it is in the content itself. So we really have to understand what's working well in our content library and what's not working well. A couple of things that were interesting. One of the things that we looked at was average duration. Again, for years and years, we always looked at the average completion or average duration that someone would watch a particular video. But turns out it's a bad metric because average duration follows a bimodal distribution curve. So some people engage a little bit and then bail out right away. Some people watch it almost to the end, but never quite to the end because nobody watches the credits, things like that. Or vice versa, people start to get into it and they're like, I'm less than 10% of the way in, I got to bail out. So we kind of embrace that. We introduced something called the attention index, where we take the percent of subscribers that watch more than 75% of a video, and we subtract the number of subscribers that watch less than 10% of a video. And we pick those because they're common thresholds that are in every video analytics package that's out there. They kind of mark how far people made it all the way through. What we find about that is it becomes this really good shortcut for entertainment value. And we can do some really interesting things in the content library. So we can start to look at, well, of course, we know our big anchor shows or programs or classes, they pull people in, they keep people engaged, and that's great. But what happens when that season ends? What's our shoulder content that we want to start to promote? Turns out the data really helps us there. We can find hidden gems that are a high attention index, but a low audience size. So that's just a content discovery problem. Maybe we need to escalate and bring them up into the carousel. We have a number of customers that in their apps now have a hidden gems ribbon, where these are all programs that they know are really compelling according to the data, and yet much lower in terms of overall audience size. So let's promote that. Hidden gems are great for filling that shoulder content before the next great season or the next great show comes out. And so those are the types of things that we're looking at all the time around that content performance, to really understand what's working well. The second big thing we see in the marketplace today is that editorial teams and even some recommendation engines, what they'll do is they end up promoting popular content to popular content. Makes sense, right? We all know what our great best shows are. But when you have a high overlap in the audience, then it's not really doing much. If I've already watched the second program and you're promoting it to me, it's just noise. Instead, what we might look at, and what our scorecard does, is it starts to look at, well, what are those promotable videos? So if you watch the first video, what are other videos that have a high attention index, but a low shared audience? Now, suddenly I've got upside as part of that, where I can start to look at that cohort and say, hey guys, I've got other great programs for you guys to check out. And I know the majority of you haven't watched that second or third program that we might be promoting. So we can use that data to start to inform how people navigate through our content library to really maximize the value of that content library. Everybody's got hidden gems in their back catalog, I guarantee it. And it's just a matter of surfacing that data and then making it usable, so the editorial team or the marketing team that's really doing that outreach and engagement can then leverage that data to inform what to watch next.
It's incredible what you can do when you can piece a bunch of data together and really understand what is the best way to engage with an audience. And it's really impressive how you've managed to figure out some of those interesting dynamics of ways in which you could take content that's maybe not performing as you'd like without even knowing it, but it's fantastic content to put it in front of customers. But you mentioned something. You mentioned the attention index. And I wanted to highlight this because what I thought was really unique about what you're doing is you have these indexes and industry benchmarks, I would say, that can set the tone, at least to help, I think, a lot of companies understand not only what you just talked about, how well their content is doing, especially with their audience, but could you highlight on some of the indexes that you currently have, what they do and how they help your customers?
Yeah, and so we're really early in our development of these benchmarks, but we think they're really important for our customers. Again, they help guide decisions. So we have indexes on trial conversion rates. It's currently sitting right around 72% of all trials convert to being paying subscribers. But it's a pretty wide distribution curve there. It's 12 points on either side for the standard deviation. And so what you've got are some customers that are converting in the 60s or even lower, and you've got some customers that are converting in the 80s and higher. And so there's a wide range of where we are there. Monthly churn rate is sitting right around 10%. Average churn per month is what we're seeing across the customer base. We have a bunch of benchmarks around engagements, hours per week, days per month, things like that. Where we use those and how that helps shape the decision making for our customers is they can really understand, are they on the right side or the wrong side of that tent pole? So eventually I'll be bigger, where I can start to spread out my news customers from my sports, from my entertainment, and from my fitness classes, all that kind of stuff. But right now, what we're really looking at is, well, just in general for the industry, are you on the right side or wrong side of that particular benchmark? And if you're on the wrong side, there's probably some best practices that we can come in, help advise on, things to really start to dig into to understand. And you can see some pretty dramatic results. You can reduce that churn rate, or you can increase that conversion rate pretty dramatically. Meanwhile, if you're on the right side of the benchmark, I've talked with executives at our customers, and they're like, my team's just not really improving our churn rate. And I'm like, you're already amazing. You're at a 3 or 4% churn in the marketplace. Like, you should probably, of course, we want to make it better, but we should probably set the expectations to be a little more incremental, because you're already beyond a standard deviation of what we normally see across the industry. And so let's set those expectations to always improve. But at the same time, we're not going to see miracles on that side of the bell curve, basically. And it really helps guide where people want to spend their time and resources in terms of where they're investing in their overall video business. And so those benchmarks really help set those guideposts for our customers.
I wanted to shift gears and talk a little bit more general and broad and moving away from the product. But before I do that, I'm just curious, what is the relationship that you have with customers? What is the type of business model? Is this just a traditional SaaS company? Is it paid for usage? How does this work?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's a traditional SaaS model. It's a software license fee. And our pricing model is based on the number of what we say is active audience members. So for a subscription video business, it's the number of trialists and customers they have. For any other type of video business, we're looking at the number of active viewers that they might have. And the reason that we're aligned that way is that we believe it's a team sport. So when you grow, we want that customer to grow as much as possible. And when they do, we benefit a little bit too. And so that's the game, is how do we get in as a team and really start to use that data to optimize these businesses, offering advice along the way, but really to grow through those key thresholds of these particular businesses, whether it's a subscription business that's trying to get from 25,000 subscribers to 100,000, or from 100,000 to 500,000. These are all key benchmarks that kind of everybody, or key milestones everyone looks for, or a general video service that's looking to push past 1 million monthly viewers, things like that. So that's kind of how we price the product, and it really, we like it, as I mentioned, because it does align us really nicely with our customers.
No, it makes 100% sense as well, because you're both incentivized to improve performance. Yeah. I'm curious, because having looked at the media landscape and lots of different companies, media industry is tricky because it evolves a lot, and there's a lot of different types of content, and content is changing, platforms are changing, content formats are changing. And I'm just curious, how do you think that affects the video industry or video streaming?
It's one of the things I love most about this particular industry. As I mentioned, I started my career as a product manager, and you have a price and you have a value proposition, and you might add to that value proposition over time. Hey, we've got a new feature, we've got a new whatever. But the video industry as a whole is this really dynamic thing where I have a business model, subscription or advertising on one side, and I have this incredibly dynamic product that's changing every single day. So I have new content that I add into the value proposition. Maybe some of my content's based on a window, and so it goes away. Maybe and it's a constantly changing value proposition. I have super fans, but they watch all of a series, or the sports season is over. What do we do around that changing value proposition as we go through the years and as we go through the seasons? And so really, that dynamic understanding of my audience to that content, that relationship, and how that works is a really fun and hard problem to solve. It's a really good thing to dig into. So that's what I really love about the video landscape. Second thing I think that is really transforming the video industry as a whole is just, again, this direct relationship with consumer. We've never had this kind of direct feedback about how compelling the content is. So perfect example, I have customers with big marquee shows that drive big audience numbers, but then we apply that 10% threshold and they lose half their audience, don't make it through the first 10% of that series. So what are you doing? Like, the historical metrics look great because everybody started it, they watched 5-10 minutes of it, whatever it is, however long it is, but they bailed out really early. Suddenly I need to understand that threshold is a lot lower than it should be, and the value that content is producing, even though it's drawing a lot of people in, it's not keeping them in. It's part of that overall service. And so really understanding that dynamic relationship between audience and content is, I think, and how audiences are engaging and when they're engaging and how frequently, all that kind of stuff is, yeah, it's a really fascinating problem to solve. It's a great rubric scheme to wake up and work with our customers on every day.
I can imagine. And that's what makes this industry, like you said, so unique, is that it is constantly evolving. It's not stationary. Mm-hmm. Content is evolving, which is the problem continues to evolve in lots of different ways. And having that versatility also for you guys to look at and continue to find in ways in which that relationship with that audience evolves regardless of format or distribution is incredible. I'm curious, and I just given recent events, how has the pandemic affected your industry or maybe even company? Or has it touched it at all?
So it was a really interesting kind of trend line throughout last year. So March and April, as shelter-in-place orders went into place, the entire subscription side of the industry blew up. Our average customers increased their customer count by 30 or 40% without spending a lot on marketing. And it makes sense. We just accelerated basically this trend of people moving to all of these services. So of course they might subscribe to a Netflix and a Disney Plus, but then there's this whole thing of all these different video services that if you're into a particular passion, whether it's British dramas or movies or all this other stuff, there's a service that's out there for you. And so everybody jumped into those services. And so we saw consumption and subscribers go through the roof. May and June, as things started opening back up again and the weather got better, what we saw was our engagement really started to drop off and everybody paused. Everybody was holding their breath because historically, when engagement drops off, as I mentioned, churn goes up and we start losing those customers. But that didn't really happen. Actually, our benchmark stayed right around that same 10%, wobbled a little bit, but it was consistent all the way through the summer months, as you would expect. And so what we think happened is people really got into these services, and some of them leave every month, but a lot of them stayed. So that's essentially for any subscription business, that's a windfall. Our customers I was talking to one, they're like, yeah, we just made our November targets and it's April 20th. And so for any subscription business, if you can move 6 months of revenue into the business ahead of time, it looks really good. And so things then really started picking back up again. As we got later in the summer, what we saw is everybody really re-engaged, started getting aggressive about upgrades, about more licensing more content. And I think, which are a lot of people talk about the businesses that dramatically accelerated through the pandemic. And obviously any video streaming service benefited from that. Now we're a little biased. We're on the subscription side of the house with most of our customers and things like that. But so we didn't really track some of the advertising implications that were out there today, or during that time period. But for the subscription video business we saw, it was definitely a boon for them. You hate to benefit from something so tragic and horrible, but you'll take the environment you're given and make the best of it, basically.
Yeah, no, it's once you put everyone inside for long periods of time, nothing better to do than just hang out.
What else are you going to do? Yeah. I feel like I personally reached the end of Netflix. What else are we going to? It's time to move on to that next service and the next service and things like that.
I also finished too many seasons that I would like to mention, but
yeah, that's right.
What happens? I have one last question here, Marty, and then we'll close out here. And thanks again for taking so much time to chat with me. I really appreciate it. I'm just curious, and you may have already highlighted a little bit earlier my question before, just the recent one, but what do you think is the future of video analytics, and what do you see that other people don't?
I think there's a couple of really interesting challenges ahead of us. I think there's still a lot more to be done around content analytics and really understanding the value of content. I think we've just scratched the surface, and every time we dig a little bit deeper or peel back another layer of the onion or whatever, we learn more about what content works well for these different audiences at different times, all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot more that we really need to understand, again, around that very dynamic content library that's always changing, that has different fans, all that kind of stuff. We need to understand that data. That data needs to inform our decisions in a lot better ways. I think that the other things that we'll see over time are more hybrid models where it's both subscription and advertising. And there's a blend that really needs to happen there. We need to really understand how much advertising can we afford to inject into a subscriber relationship before we start to turn off the subscriber in some way. So now we've got basically a subscription and content library. Now we throw in a third variable, which is ad load and the types of ads that are running and all that type of. And so now we actually have to understand how all three of those work together in a more interesting way. So there's some really interesting things to explore out there as well. Yeah, beyond that, I think under the hood, what we're also going to see is that whether it's data science or data engineering, it's also an engineering practice that's been evolving very quickly over the last couple of years. It's one thing to say you have big data, but it's another thing to actually turn that data into something that's understandable and actionable. And so there's a lot to be learned about that whole data pipeline, how to keep it accurate, how to keep it validated and in sync with kind of the source of truth. All kinds of hard engineering problems that sit under the hood. Hopefully nobody has to see that stuff because companies like mine are going to clean that up underneath. But some really interesting and hard engineering challenges as the data scales up over time.
Thank you, Marty. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time. Before I close out, is there any other asks or things that you want to announce or share with the audience?
Like I said, I think it's really the way we look at it. This is a team sport. We're all in this together. And so anything that we can share, our blog posts, our other things, our best practices on what's working well, we're happy to put it out there. Happy to have people come and ask us about it. Whether they need our product or not, we really look at it as a rising tide. And so everybody really benefits by learning about what this industry is, what's working well today, and checking back in 3 or 4 months because it's a pretty dynamic space and it could be something different that's working down the road.
Marty, with that, I thank you again so much for taking the time. And just to recap why we had this interview, we looked at quite a few companies in the video analytics space, and Wicket Labs was doing a really impressive job within this category specifically. And we heard a little bit more in detail about it today. You've done a fantastic job with pulling different data silos from whether it's the payment tools, whether it's the site engagement, whether it's the content itself. I think what's underestimated, maybe if you're looking out from the outside in, is how complex of a problem this actually is from a data perspective and how you can make that process so simple and aggregating information and pulling insights that's valuable and then actually driving impactful decisions to your customers. And whether that's engaging or better building relationships with their audience or making sure that they're being careful about how they utilize the right types of content and where to distribute it and how to distribute it. And it's impressive. And I think a really important tool for the industry overall. So, and on top of that, you have some really cool benchmarks and indexes. I don't see that anywhere else. The scorecards, those are really cool. So Marty, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for chatting with us.